Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today to share my work with you. And many thanks to the many people that work to make this a reality. I'm deeply appreciative. Special thanks for Alejo for first reaching out and for instigating this whole thing. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been trying to think through the relationship between climate change and white supremacy. And before I get into my formal talk, I want to talk a little bit about kind of like the long history about how I got here in terms of my larger intellectual kind of journey. Um, when I first got the invitation from Alejo, he's like, you can talk about anything about environmental justice that you want. And the truth is, I'm not really working on EJ these days. I've really, ever since Trump was elected, I have really shifted to thinking a lot more about forces of domination and thinking about the right I've become very interested in. The other thing that happened is that I've been working for, I guess, almost 10 years now on cultural memory and thinking about the way hegemonic forms of US cultural memory represent processes of white supremacy and colonization. And this is something I've worked very closely with Tiana Bruno with. She's been really one of my intellectual partners in this very, very big project. And one of the things that we did is we looked through 2,600 national historic landmarks about how they represent white supremacy and colonization. And we found these just staggering levels of denial and erasure. And this really got me to thinking, my God, denial is just like if it is such a key component of US culture and society, might it not spill over into other things and arenas where you would not anticipate it necessarily? And of course, the first thing that came to my mind was climate, given my interest around environmental issues and EJ and whatnot. And I really wrestled for a number of years, like, well, how do I study this? I wasn't sure. So when in doubt, I began collecting data. That's what I do. And I then began collecting data around this. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today, this ongoing project, trying to think it out together. I'm really excited to be with people that are invested in these questions because I don't have all the answers, but I welcome being on a journey with all of you to talk about these things. So let me begin my formal presentation here. So I started this work hoping to document how we got to the current climate crisis. Part of me was curious. How and why do we refuse to stop burning fossil fuels in the face of impending disaster? And part of me was angry. Who is to blame? I'm especially angry knowing that we have wasted precious decades that could have made a difference. According to the UN, current climate policies have us on track for a 4.8-degree temperature increase by 2100. And just last week, it was announced that we had hit the 1.5-degree benchmark. This is all despite the fact that scientific consensus has existed at least since 2006. Moreover, we have known how to mitigate the crisis, if not solve it. And yet, we refuse to engage in meaningful action. So I'm angry. I wish to document, I wish to blame, and I wish to bear witness to this historic moment that we are living in. Of course, there are positive things happening. I don't want to pretend like there's not, especially the proliferation of renewable energy. But this does not change the fact that emissions continue to climb. In fact, the US is set to produce more crude oil than ever. Countries that were committed to cutbacks, like Brazil and Canada, are also backsliding. Their logic is that as long as a market demand exists, we will meet it. My analysis centers on the Republican Party and its refusal to act over the last 15 years. At first, I assumed it was just doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry, what is often called regulatory capture. But as I looked at the data, I realized that there was more going on. In fact, when I juxtaposed the data with larger changes in the racial formation, I began to see some connections. They are not obvious, nor are they causal, but I think they are real. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm first going to explain why the GOP's actions cannot be explained as just a case of regulatory capture. Second, I introduce the concept of surplus white nationalism to help explain what might be going on. And third, I present three different moments of climate obstruction and their connection to white nationalism. They are first, the rise of the Tea Party from 2009 to 2015. Second, the Trump era from June 2015 to January 2020. And then the GOP's war on wokeness from 2021 to the present. Now, many scholars, such as Oreskes, have documented the fossil fuels industry disinformation campaign, which has so contributed to widespread denial. More recently, researchers have shifted their attention from denial to focusing on refusing to act or pursuing very limited action, what Michael Mann calls inactivism. I argue that the GOP is not engaged in inactivism, but rather full-on obstruction. These are deliberate, premeditated efforts that intensify climate warming by blocking climate action and supporting fossil fuels. Drawing on colleagues like Kari Norgaard and Kara Daggett, we can think of climate inaction along a spectrum: ignorance, denial, enabling, refusal, and obstruction. Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective, drawing on Althusser, argue that the fossil fuel industry's denial machine should be understood as an ideological state apparatus, or an ISA. An ISA is a system of defined institutions, organizations, and the corresponding practices, which, through their day-to-day activities, uphold some elements of dominant ideology. The dominant ideology in question here, of course, is the belief that fossil fuels are good. Moreover, they point out that this belief is rooted in a particular mode of accumulation, one based on fossil fuels, what they call fossil capital. Fossil capital is facing an existential crisis, and the state, as part of the fossil fuel ISA, has sought to bolster it. It is important to underscore that both political parties are implicated in the fossil fuel ISA, but the two parties are not the same, at least not anymore. Democrats have a record of attempting climate action, however limited. This is evident, for example, in Biden's seesawing approach to climate change and the coexistence of Joe Manchin and the Green New Deal within the same party. And I think this is important to point out because I think a lot of time progressives or people on the left say, oh, both parties, they're both complete failures. Well, not untrue, but really the difference is really quite significant now. Of course, democratic initiatives are hardly radical. Since the Kyoto Protocol, capitalist climate governance has been the norm. Capitalist climate governance is not denial, but strategies that postpone meaningful action while creating new opportunities for capital. You would think this is something the GOP could get behind, given their politics, as it aligns with free markets, new industries, and state subsidies for capital. But that has not happened. Over the past 15 years, the entire Republican Party has systematically obstructed climate action. Here are some of the key forms that this obstruction has taken: blocking legislation, introducing regressive legislation, actively supporting fossil fuel production, blocking appointees that were supportive of climate mitigation, judicial decisions, and suing the state at all levels for supporting any kind of climate action. So let me digress for a moment and talk a little bit about how I began collecting this information. I was initially interested in attacks on critical race theory that began surfacing in 2021. And I began just collecting a list of such attacks just by listening to the radio, reading the New York Times, just, everything that was in my environment. But then I began seeing how they were sometimes paired with climate issues, which I'll be talking a lot more about this as we go on. This led me then to develop parallel lists, all the attacks on CRT and DEI, and then what was happening in the world of climate. But the climate stuff just got crazier and crazier. So I had to really dig deeper as I got very, very intrigued. For example, this is a relatively recent one. North Carolina passed a law prohibiting public EV charging stations unless there were also free public fossil fuel gas stations. All right. And then they actually allocated money to destroy the EV charging stations. I mean, like, what kind of policy is this, right? It's just like so over the top, right? This is what then led me to really focus on the GOP and their climate agenda. And so some of the questions I began asking is, when did this start? What are the various forms of climate obstruction that the GOP is engaged in? Who are the key actors? How has it changed over time? And how is this connected to race? So I've been building this database with the help of various research assistants, and we're probably about 85% done. We are not done. But the results just were so overwhelming. I do not believe that the missing data is in any way going to change the outcome or the conclusions around around the fact that the GOP has really been engaging in awe-inspiring levels of obstruction. And this is something we desperately need to be paying close attention to. Now, you may think, again, this is just politicians doing what their donors want to do. And there certainly is truth to that. I do not want to pretend otherwise. For example, 80% of all fossil fuel money goes to Republicans. This is based on 2022 data here, and we can see Kevin McCarthy up at the top. And the blue lines are Democratic politicians, both from Texas, all right? So there certainly is that going on. I don't want to, again, pretend otherwise, but I don't believe this tells the whole story, all right? And there's 4 shortcomings, I think, with the whole narrative around regulatory capture. The first is that the GOP has not always aligned with the fossil fuel industry. Second, the GOP's climate obstruction does not reflect its voters' desires. 3, this overlooks the role of race and assumes a non-racial state. And lastly, it ignores the larger cultural meanings embedded in climate change. So let me go through each of these briefly in turn. First, the GOP has not always aligned with the fossil fuel industry. Capital is nothing if not practical. It knows the future and is planning for energy alternatives and maintaining fossil fuel production. From a capitalist perspective, this makes perfect sense. For example, in 2021, the American Petroleum Institute identified actions to combat climate change, including putting a price on carbon. Shell and BP are getting into renewables. And ExxonMobil just announced its first lithium well it's going to drill in Arkansas. Now, I don't want to greenwash the fossil fuel industry here in any way, shape, or form, right? But this contrasts, as you will see, dramatically with what the GOP has been doing. Moreover, it's important to understand that the GOP has not always been so resistant. The Bush administration, working with the fossil fuel industry's Global Climate Coalition, left the Kyoto Protocol and introduced the Clear Skies Initiative, a much weaker plan based on voluntary cutbacks and tax credits. Here, the GOP is bowing to the industry, but realizes the need for some kind of action. In contrast, for the last 15 years, I'll be sounding like a broken record, it has systematically blocked all climate action. Number 2, the GOP's climate obstruction does not reflect its base, especially young Republican voters. Surveys indicate that large majorities of Americans believe climate change is real. 94% of Democrats and 67% of Republicans believe in climate change. And here I want to draw your attention to the red. The red marker is charting the Republican respondents here in this survey, which is from the Andrew Leisowitz outfit over at Yale. Over 60% of Republicans believe the government should take some action on climate. And here again, the lowest we see is 63% among Republicans. 75% support tax breaks to encourage renewable energies. And I want you to remember this because this is something we're going to come back to. Now, there definitely is disagreement between the two parties on how to approach climate. I don't want to pretend otherwise. They can be very far apart. But what I do believe is very clear is that the GOP's not doing, it is not reflecting its base. Its base is not asking for climate obstruction. So there is a misalignment, and we need to ask what else is going on. The third reason we need to look beyond regulatory capture is that it assumes a non-racial state. If the fossil fuel ISA exists at the intersection of the state and civil society, and if race is a material discursive formation embedded in US history, territory, and culture, it presumably plays a role in many topics seemingly unrelated to race. Heather McGhee, in The Sum of Us, shows how racism costs all Americans and is responsible for such things as the absence of universal health care in the US. She argues that because whites worried Black people would disproportionately benefit from universal health care, they opposed it altogether. In short, she argues that racism is at the core of our democracy's dysfunction. The final problem stemming from a regulatory capture framework is that it overlooks the many meanings embedded in fossil fuel and climate change. Naomi Klein has argued that the right understands the profound challenge that climate change poses to its worldview and values. She argues that climate change is in fact an indictment of capitalism. It poses a crisis not just to our physical world, but to the right's ideology. Thus, the GOP's commitment to obstruction is an attempt to deny an existential threat. The ISA framework helps us understand how various meanings become attached to fossil fuels. Recall that it is a system of institutions, organizations, and practices which uphold dominant ideologies. Three features of the fossil fuel ISA are especially relevant to my analysis. First, as previously mentioned, ISAs operate at the interface of civil society and the state. Thus, there is a robust arena which allows for all kinds of connections. Second, the far right and the fossil fuel ISAs are intimately connected, which we can see, for example, by the many think tanks which have manufactured denial, right? And they're very, very busy right now working on, I think called Report 2025 for what, for example, the Trump administration might implement should it get into office. And lastly, white nationalism is a central feature of the US right. White nationalism is a feature of all the rights in the world, but in the US, it's about white nationalism. And I really want to hone in now on white nationalism. Drawing on Benedict Anderson and Sunira Subani, I define the white nation as an imagined sovereign political community in which white people and whiteness are centered. Because whiteness is a hierarchical, genocidal, and exclusionary category, its legitimacy requires the erasure of its violence. This entails the cultivation and maintenance of white innocence. The problem for the white nation is that it is facing multiple crises. Not only are the demographics of the US changing, what is called the Great Replacement, but the very innocence of the white nation is being questioned like never before. This is evident in such things, of course, as Black Lives Matter and calls for a racial and colonial reckoning. Thus, the right is contending with two major crises. And I wish to explore this overlapping section here in the Venn diagram. This is where white nationalism becomes linked to climate obstruction. White nationalism has been key to the GOP's success for decades now. It realized in 1970, with the Southern Strategy, that actively cultivating white grievance and resentment is a winning strategy. This reliance on white nationalism has led to what I call surplus white nationalism, which I define as the excessive energy and power of white nationalism that cannot be contained or selectively controlled. Because it spills over onto seemingly unrelated areas with sometimes unanticipated consequences, it is surplus. While white nationalism is a central dynamic of the right, surplus white nationalism impacts many parts of society, and I argue has actively contributed to climate obstruction. Surplus white nationalism produces value both for the right, through votes and political support, and the larger fossil fuel industry. I now want to share 3 specific moments of GOP climate obstruction, which illustrate different logics as well as its overall trajectory. And I begin with the Tea Party. And this emerged in 2009. I don't, how many people lived through the Tea Party? Old enough to remember that. Sure. So you may recall it arose in response to the corporate bailout after the 2008 economic collapse. And many people, I'm really surprised when I go back, they frame it as an economic and political movement, which it was, but that completely overlooks its connection to white nationalism. Specifically, it was energized by the election of Barack Obama and quickly gave rise to the birther movement, which insisted that Obama was not actually born in the US and therefore not a legitimate president, because how could a Black man actually be president of the US? It also became virulently anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim. The Tea Party embodied what Hosang and Lowndes call the productive parasite paradigm, the producer parasite paradigm, in which Latino immigrants were seen as overly entitled and undeserving, and Muslims were suspected of terrorism and trying to take over the US. The Tea Party unleashed a torrent of white rage that swept 138 new Republicans into Congress. By one estimate, the Tea Party movement generated anywhere from 2.7 to 5.5 million additional votes for the GOP in 2010. The Tea Party is enormously important in understanding the contemporary right, as it opened the floodgates to a new political landscape. The Tea Party engaged in climate obstruction in at least three ways. First, it contributed to an increase in denial. Second, it opened the door to climate obstruction. And 3, it popularized anti-statism. And I'm just going to address the first 2. Until 2009, there had been a slow and steady uptick in the belief that climate change was real and human-caused. But in 2009, we see a reversal. This is the same image I showed you before. And so here we see starts in 2009, and here we go, hitting a low point around 2011. This was due to ClimateGate. And here I'm drawing on the work of Andrew Leiserowitz. ClimateGate was a 2009 leak from East Anglia University's Climate Research Unit that the right used as proof that the climate change was a hoax and climate scientists were frauds. Because of the right-wing media ecosystem, Tea Party members disproportionately believed it. ClimateGate fit with a larger anti-elitist, anti-state narrative, what Arlie Hochschild calls the deep story, and led to actual declines in climate change belief. It also energized GOP politicians who went on the attack. Most notable was Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma, who published Consensus Exposed, the CRU Controversy, in which he argued against the existence of a scientific consensus. But more ominous were state challenges to the EPA. Several states sued the EPA to stop it from regulating greenhouse gases. And a group of GOP attorney generals challenged the EPA's endangerment finding, which refers to its determination that greenhouse gases endangered people and therefore should be regulated. Well, the substance of this demand is certainly important. Equally significant was the strategy. Republican attorney generals acting in concert. And this is a strategy that will grow over time. So how was it connected to surplus white nationalism? Both the emergence and decline of the Tea Party were energized by it. Research indicates that not only were Tea Party members more likely to see people of color as parasites, but they also mourned the loss of their country. Again, drawing from Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land. But the decline of the Tea Party is also deeply wedded to white nationalism. Its energy and rage led directly to the election of Donald Trump. And the Tea Party essentially morphed into MAGA beginning in June 2015. which brings us to the Trump era. Here we see a major increase in climate obstruction. It can be broken down into three categories: a few spectacular transgressive acts, efforts to undermine scientific research regarding climate, and reversing the progress made under Obama. And I'll just discuss the first two. Although Trump did not talk much about climate during his first campaign, he offered two powerful signals that revealed his position, both of which were very transgressive. First, leaving the Paris Climate Accord, and second, the war on coal. Both of these events were filled with meaning. The war on coal was how he characterized the Obama administration's climate action. Trump declared the war over in March 2017 when he passed an executive order revoking rules on carbon emissions. But the war on coal was not just about carbon emissions. As suggested earlier, it was also an anti-elitist position. The war on coal must be seen as a discursive strategy that flipped what was becoming normative thinking regarding carbon emissions, i.e., we need to limit them. Second, it was also a way to connect with coal miners, 90% of whom are white and 93% of whom are male. As such, they represent a key demographic: rural, white, male, working class voters. But Trump used coal to portray himself as a friend of workers. He successfully linked together several key political strands: struggling whites, anti-elitism, and the fossil fuel industry. But the most impactful form of climate obstruction was the systematic overturning of Obama-era actions. Trump overturned 112 of Obama-era environmental regulations. The first two categories that we see here on the slide are air pollution and emissions, and then drilling and extraction, which are most closely, of course, aligned with climate issues here. And these account for almost half of all the rollbacks that we saw during this era. The Rodian Group estimated that the rollbacks added 1.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent into the atmosphere. Altogether, the rollbacks were vast and diverse. They range from changing the social cost of carbon from $43 per ton under Obama to $5 per ton under Trump, to the departure of over 1,200 scientists and environmental policy experts. But easily, the most significant act was repealing Obama's Clean Power Plan. This was the US first effort to shift our power infrastructure away from fossil fuels. It was repealed and replaced with the far weaker Affordable Clean Energy Plan. So instead of establishing national and state level emission goals and strategies, individual coal plants are supposed to be more efficient, with states ensuring that they meet their efficiency goals. This was a total gift to the coal industry. So how is this connected to white nationalism? First, race and immigration were the bedrocks of Trump's first campaign and presidency. Recall how he announced his candidacy in 2015 by declaring Mexicans as rapists and criminals. Here, in this moment, he was hailing the white nation, and we saw the Tea Party morph into MAGA. This is a key moment in the US racial formation. Second, Trump's racist agenda served to distract from environmental deregulation. This is something that Professor Bruno and I have written about elsewhere. Remember? We found in our analysis that Trump's racist agenda in his first year was very loud. That means he was talking about it all the time, with most of the attention and spectacle focused on the Muslim ban and building the border wall. In contrast, his environmental agenda was stealth, quiet, and devastating. In short, we see Trump doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry, but it is myopic to disregard the role of racism in how he got into office, the distraction racism provided, the multiple meanings of fossil fuels, and how he implemented his agenda. The final era I discuss is the war on wokeness. Despite the climate crisis worsening around the globe and clear majorities in the US wanting climate action, the GOP has attacked climate action in an innovative fashion by directly linking it to the war on wokeness. Now, after the Trump presidency, two important things happened. First, Biden gets elected, and we see actual progress on climate. Certainly, maybe not be all the action we would have liked to have seen, but there was actual stuff happened. Specifically, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022. This was the US most significant climate legislation to date. Second thing that happened, very important, was the fight for the soul of the Republican Party began. Now, many in the GOP, if you may recall, came to believe that Trump was a liability, given his impeachment and role in the January 6th insurrection. Accordingly, many Republicans wanted a change in leadership. I know it may not seem like it now, but it really was happening. The problem, of course, was that Trump still controlled the majority of the GOP base, or MAGA. So, just until a few weeks ago, until last month, for the past several years, what we have seen is we've seen multiple politicians busy courting MAGA. If one of them could have attracted MAGA support, the GOP could then have nominated somebody besides Trump. Obviously, that didn't happen. The political struggle contributed directly to the war on wokeness. Just because they failed in doing it does not change the fact that the war on wokeness, this political battle, greatly increased climate obstruction. So it's a very recent history that we're living through. Wokeness, or being awake, is the right's caricature of left politics. Specifically, it ridicules things as identity politics, pronouns, and anti-racism in order to undermine them. It began as a response to the anti-racism movement that developed after the murder of George Floyd in March 2020. As you may recall, there was massive public support for Black Lives Matter across the country and even across the globe. Kimberly Crenshaw argues that the war on wokeness is the backlash to the insistence that Black lives actually do matter, as well as calls for a racial and colonial reckoning. Throughout US history, all forms of racial progress have been followed by a white backlash, dating back to at least Reconstruction. The current backlash began with critiques of police as racist. The right responded by defending police or Blue Lives Matter. They especially rejected claims that police were racist. And this is important because white innocence was being directly challenged by anti-racist activists. So the white nation mobilized. This led to direct attacks on critical race theory and DEI. Can I get to the next slide? What do I do here? Do I have to get out of? I'm stuck. I'm trapped. I'm trapped in transitions. How do I get to the next slide?
Oh, okay.
That one. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Max. So glad he's here. All right. So here we can see the states where some kind of CRT restriction has been introduced. As of June, there were only 6 states where legislation had not been introduced. And this winter, attacks against DEI, as we all saw, played a role in the removal of 2 university presidents. Attacks against CRT then leapt into gender studies. I don't know if y'all remember this. And then that led into direct legislative attacks on queer and transgendered bodies, including Florida's infamous Don't Say Gender law, which is an effort to erase anyone not cis heteronormative. So we have all this ferocious energy directed against anti-racism, gender equality, and the right to be queer and trans. In this moment, we see 3 ways that climate change becomes linked to wokeness. First, the GOP resists linking climate change to structural change. Second, it insists the real existential threat is wokeness. And lastly, we see a link through strategy. So the first one, the right opposes linking climate to demands for structural change. Calls for such change are dismissed as part of the loony left or communist plots. For example, GOP states have banned investment in firms like BlackRock from doing business because they, quote, discriminate against fossil fuels. Likewise, the GOP has blocked financial leaders and firms from considering the cost of climate change and risk assessments, as seen in the withdrawal of Sarah Bloom Raskin as a candidate to lead the Federal Reserve. And of course, for most of this audience here, I guess we hardly see these things as radical. I mean, these are just really the most kind of pedestrian, really complicit strategies we can imagine. And still, this is what's happening. Number two, the GOP insists that the real existential threat is wokeness. Children in particular are threatened and must be protected. On the one hand, this must be seen as a form of distraction. Just like climate, most voters do not support the war on wokeness. Only segments of the MAGA base do, and that is what, of course, politicians are catering to. But if indeed the GOP is contending with twin existential threats, the obsession with wokeness is also a form of denial. First, it is denying the reality of climate change, including the need for structural transformation. The GOP realizes that a woke orientation can, in fact, lead people to believe that climate change is real and does require fundamental change and transformation. Thus, it must be stopped. And second, the GOP's obsession with wokeness is a clear denial of US white supremacy. Republicans do not believe that white supremacy is a core feature of the US and will stop at nothing to stop others from believing it as well. And you might have all heard Nikki Haley when she was a candidate, right? One of the clear things she said, the US has never been a racist country. So says the governor of South Carolina, right? And finally, GOP climate obstruction borrows strategy from the war on wokeness, both through book banning and curriculum changes. Book banning has become a central feature of the war on wokeness. In just a 6-month period in 2022, almost 1,500 books were banned. 30% were by people of color and 25% by LGBTQ plus authors. Several states, including Texas and Oklahoma, are trying to ban books that don't tell both sides of the climate story. And Florida has approved the use of educational videos on climate from PragerU, which is funded by right-wing radio host Dennis Prager. None of this, of course, can be understood outside of a deeply polarized country, where GOP politicians compete to see who can do the most outrageous things in the war on wokeness to attract MAGA support. As Florida Governor Ron DeSantis says, Florida is where wokeness goes to die. But not all acts of climate obstruction are performative. In 2022, 0 Republicans voted for Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Moreover, since Republicans regained the House in 2023, they have tried to repeal it and replace it with the Limit, Save, Grow Act. Central to the bill is a section called Replace Market Distorting Green Tax Credits, which repeals over a dozen tax credits meant to encourage the energy transition. Recall that tax credits were something favored by both majorities of both political parties in the US. And this is the sampling of some of the things that they're wanting to take away the tax credits from. Renewable energies, solar wind in low-income communities, energy efficient commercial buildings, new clean electric vehicles, refueling, and even nuclear power, all right? Which again, I mean, that was historically something the right has like totally got behind. This is our solution to climate, right? More nuclear power. Perhaps the most significant obstruction today is the lawsuit West Virginia versus EPA, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA does not have the authority to regulate CO2 emissions. Only Congress does. We have yet to see how this will play out, but it will likely gut regulations across the social and environmental landscape. The right has been trying to curb the administrative state for decades, and has finally succeeded thanks to the current judiciary, which has 3 Trump appointees. The Supreme Court, of course, as we know, is now to the far right of the US population and out of step. I would be remiss, however, if I did not mention the Conservative Climate Caucus. This is a group of GOP lawmakers who feel that the party must respond to climate change, and they actually began meeting in secret in 2021. They actually began meeting in a closet, and they're now out of the closet. I'm not kidding. Initially, I thought this might be a form of climate action. And to a certain extent, it is, as it acknowledges climate change as real and has begun organizing around it. However, it can also just be seen as a case of greenwashing. Its stated goal is to, quote, educate House Republicans on climate policies and legislation consistent with conservative values, unquote. Their solutions include fossil fuels and, quote, fighting against radical progressive climate proposals that would hurt our economy, American workers, and national security. Needless to say, its members oppose such things as tax credits for electric vehicles. And finally, here we are again with Trump running for president. His campaign does not bode well for climate action. Perhaps not surprisingly, his campaign has doubled down on immigration. But while in the past he downplayed climate obstruction, he now loudly embraces it, proclaiming that if elected, he would begin, quote, mass deportations and drill, 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 unquote, on his first day. There's a lot going on here. First, we see the coupling of white nationalism and climate obstruction. Second, we see a shift in his climate discourse. There's nothing secret or quiet about his aggressive agenda. Drill, drill, drill signals to MAGA that he will continue to be a disruptor, to flaunt normative expectations, and to fully support the fossil fuel industry, as it is the antithesis of wokeness. So, to conclude, I am certainly not arguing that white nationalism has caused the US's long history of climate obstruction, denial, and disinformation. But if we trace the history of how we got to where we are today, I believe that white nationalism is an important factor. It has been one thread woven through a rich and complex tapestry. White nationalism has unleashed tremendous energy and power that the GOP covets. Not only will they do whatever they can to gain the allegiance of MAGA, but its surplus nature enables many other possibilities, including distraction, unanticipated couplings, authoritarianism, unrepresentative courts, transgressive behavior, and the erosion of the administrative state. Moreover, we can see how it's varied over time. In the Tea Party era, white nationalism helped fuel the movement, but climate and racism were still 2 separate spheres. During the Trump era, surplus white nationalism both fueled MAGA and served as a distraction to massive environmental deregulation. And finally, in the war on wokeness, we see a direct convergence of surplus white nationalism and climate. Climate is linked to efforts to protect white innocence while also serving as a distraction and a form of denial. Clearly, climate has taken on far greater meanings in a polarized political landscape. It has become attached to a whole series of political identities, constituencies, and movements, especially an energized white nationalist base. Thank you. Okay, so there were 2 questions. The first one is about, was I tracking any of this internationally? And the second was about the criminalization of activism in the US. So I don't know a lot about either one, but so I did not in any formal way pay attention to what was happening internationally. Having said that, I have been hearing more and more connections that are happening. And it does seem that after really recently, since like 2021, so after the pandemic, there was like kind of a dip in like fossil fuels and because of what was happening economically. And then there was this huge rebound after the pandemic, and we see fossil fuels coming back by like never before, here in the United States very strongly, and we do see it in other countries as well. And there are also particularly ones, not always, but some where there has been authoritarian leaders. I claim no knowledge or expertise, but I have been following a little bit, and we're beginning to see changes in Germany and in other countries as well, where people are just kind of rolling back and giving more and more space to the fossil fuel industry. And I don't know if there is that connection with the criminalization, or this is people just also taking a wider view from taking the cues from the United States, but I think we probably led the way, in that. And I, it, I need to do a deeper dive into exactly those moments and what happened. But it's something around the pandemic which leads to this complete shift in where we're going and this new enablement of the fossil fuel industry. So I think it is happening in places, but we're just like far and away the head. No one compares. Where we are in this way. Yeah. Yeah.
So obviously, I was also in LA. My question is kind of from, being a scholar, essentially a future educator. I was sort of wondering like what implications white nationalism and climate obstruction for the education system and activists, because I'm always kind of about what are the ways we can kind of mobilize each side on the ground.
Mm-hmm. So the question was about the connections between white nationalism and climate obstruction for the educational system and for activism. So activism. I feel that I guess, and I say this as somebody who has a history of activism and very much as a scholar, we do not pay enough attention to the right. I feel like within the larger kind of EJ scholarship world, and I totally respect this. I am part of this. I've been part of this. We are much more wanting to focus on the great work that communities are doing. Look what Indigenous people are doing, power development, creating power, right? And capacity. And they're much more inspiring things to study. They are energizing things to study. And this is not that. It's really kind of soul killing to study. And I don't know how much longer I actually can continue studying it as well. So I really want to make a plea for people to begin studying the right more. We ignore it at our peril. We absolutely ignore it at our peril. They are organized, they're moving ahead, they've got a very clear agenda in a level of organization that we cannot even begin to imagine. Truly, we cannot begin. If again, people are paying attention to the Trump campaign and the think tanks, they've got their agenda ready to roll. And I don't know this to be true, but I know me and Tiana have talked about this. Like in the Trump administration's first administration, they didn't know what they were doing in terms of like many things, right? Because they didn't anticipate winning and stuff. But the one area, and there might have been others, but the one area they did know what to do is they knew what to do about environmental deregulation. And that was because the right had all that agenda worked out. So it was just like taking a page and let's just implementing it. And it went much smoother, right, than the other ones because the level of organization. So I really wish that people would begin, and activists particularly begin paying more attention to these things. I also think in terms of education, I'm a big fan of doing like collaborative research projects in my classes. And I think this is something that as educators we can do. We can start educating students by just starting to study the right, in taking off a small piece of the puzzle, whatever it is. And that's a way to really to learn about it and hopefully get students interested in pursuing that. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, Jimena. I'm going to come to you in a second, but I first want to read a question from online. Is there a gendered aspect to this relationship between white nationalism and climate obstruction? In light of what you said earlier about how this orientation of obstruction does not align with the views of the Republican base, perhaps there are differences between Republican men and women.
Okay, so thank you for that question. I don't, so actually, I think there might have been some, I might have seen some survey data with a slight difference between Republican men and women, with women being more apt to believe that climate change was real than men and advocating for action. It wasn't a huge one. The big, of course, the difference is generationally that you see it. When we come thinking about the climate obstruction, and I'm really drawing very heavily, there is absolutely, it's very gendered in terms of the, I think, kind of the rhetoric, the discourse, the performative elements in it. You know, Cara Daggett uses the term petromasculinity, and I think it's a really wonderful term to talk about the many meanings, again, of fossil fuel. And I feel, you know, Trump is very much performing that when he talks about the connections with not just with coal, but I'm going to take on those climate activists and I'm going to, you know, American energy first. All that is a very highly masculinist kind of whole demeanor that he has taken on. That is something I need to do more work on, but I think it's very real.
Yeah, so I've definitely been thinking a lot of this, I guess, like tension and intersections of like critical race theory and climate action, and like the obstruction side. And in that context, I'm wondering if you had any insight into like, is there a trend on like the moderate Democrat side to like move away from CRT and like the DEI justice rhetoric in service of getting some moderate or like capitalist climate action pushed through? Like, is that a trend that you have seen happen, and like how does that fit in sort of this like white nationalist kind of framework?
Thank you for that question, Kieran. Yeah, this brings up a really important point. Thank you for asking that. So we have, you know, I've been documenting, here's what the Republican Party has done, but that is one of the spillover effects. They have been so forceful and powerful in what they're doing that has also pushed Democrats, and you are correct, into moving to more moderate positions. And we can see the change, you know, even in Biden since he got into office, when they were like at least acknowledging environmental justice and that kind of stuff like that. And so, you know, again, this partly explains his seesawing, like, oh God, I got my young voters here, but, you know, I got to appeal to the moderates over here. And I'm getting so much pressure from the right, you know, as they're kind of co-opting the whole thing about American energy freedom, autonomy, and things like that. So yeah, they are, it's again, one of the larger spillover effects that we see a movement in that direction for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was great. You know, I totally agree with you in that we haven't spent enough time looking at the right. I think Democrats figured if they just got the vote out, you know, we'd win every time. But I think it's been 40 years of Republican strategy. They just get control of the courts, control the agencies, and now get control of this court. We've got our sleeves here. You did mention authoritarianism at the end of the talk. And I've noticed that Trump has actually played with that notion quite significantly. And I was extremely surprised, but just kind of surprised at the reception. People were kind of nodding and cheering and that. So I'm wondering if you thought about that notion of authoritarianism, what that might do for him, or can it be a divisive? Is that the limit? Is that the end point? Start to say we're going to take these. Are certain Republicans and institutions, networks, you know, that's too much. Growth.
Right.
And then the last thing, and maybe well, I'll listen as well. I'm wondering how, you know, in my recent work in Michigan, I've really been following networks, the financial networks, and the connections between. Some people are actually very ideologically approached, but have investments in certain ways. And so, if you look at the finance and the investment strategies, you see a clear picture of how in the back that builds on these policies. So, 2 questions.
Thank you. So authoritarianism. Thank you. It's super important. So I've just been, you know, as part of my like studying at the right, I pay a lot of attention to like why MAGA and why people support Trump. And, that is one of his great attractions. It is the authoritarianism. He has convinced people the country's going to hell in a handbasket, and I'm the only one who can save this. He did this in his first, and people believe it now, I think, even more, that he can save it. So his authoritarianism is part of his appeal for his support. And I mean, it's all about loyalty. There's nothing that will make him unacceptable to his base. He can do whatever he wants, right? Because of the loyalty factor. And again, paying attention to the work that's happening to prepare for a Trump administration. They're absolutely vetting people that can go into the administration, and their number one requirement is loyalty, right? Because what they saw in the first administration is they saw actual public servants is like, no, we can't do this. This is illegal, or this is like, contrary to policy or procedure, right? And now they realize, well, if we just get rid of those people, we can do whatever we want. So it's continuing building upon that, just like getting loyalists into office. So it's very, very scary in that way. In terms of the second part of the question about like following the money. So I have not done enough work in that, I think. We do know yeah, thank you. Yours is a good example, a methodology to follow in terms of doing it. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in with a quick question from online. We have a question from Chloe Cooper of Political Research Associates. And Chloe asks, can you speak about the main right-wing groups or organizations that have been at the vanguard of climate change denialism?
So thank you for that question. Thank you, PRA, and all the work that you do. I think it has been mostly the think tanks, I think. So the right, as we know, is very well funded, and they have, tried to develop a whole infrastructure of places to begin developing these ideas. I think one of the earlier ones too, I mentioned this at breakfast, is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which has been around for quite a while. And they have been developing, they're kind of in the trenches, like, okay, at the local level, what can we do? And somebody, Lisa, you asked about like activism, the criminalization. I think those things, came out of ALEC, I think, kind of all those slap suits, right? To go after activists. It's like, how do we criminalize this at the local level? Let's go up to the state level. Let's bring it up to the federal level, right? So we just see it happening. So there's the Harvest. Wait, it's not heritage. It's another H word. Heartland. Thank you. Heartland Institute, right? That has been really one of the key ones in terms of this climate action, ALEC, heritage. So the usual suspects have been very, very busy and hard at work. I don't see, certainly within academia, people working at all to, kind of create. No scientist is like, I think supporting this, that kind of work anymore that we can point to. I mean, there were those deniers that did go on for quite a while. So I don't want to, pretend that doesn't exist or didn't exist. But I don't think any scientists now are doing that, although many are within the frame of operating, of course, of climate capital governance, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It's so incredible. Something that I found really interesting in the graph where you were tracking the post-climate gate drop in Republican belief in climate was that there was almost equal drop in belief among Democrats and independents that was being tracked.
Yeah.
And I thought it was so interesting because, of course, those are totally different media ecosystems. I was wondering if you tracked how that drop sort of, how that drop translated across the three sort of political lines. Was it all because of this climate gate thing directly, or was it that the climate gate reveal changed how things were being discussed in certain media that then changed how it was being discussed in maybe more democratic facing media like that?
Yeah, so again, this has been very well studied by others. I know at first it's like, really? This happened? But it has been lots of survey data that was done, and it was responsible for a blip across the country that we did see. And again, it was like really just like, Democrats, independent, and Republicans. And it is just seemed to be attributable to the right-wing media ecosystem. It just went so much further. At that time when this was happening, this was still the time when, like, when journalists felt like we have to give both sides, right? And it was still like both sides of climate. Oh, so let's go find those two scientists who deny that it's, anthropogenic, right? As well as, like, we saw that also with politicians, like we have to have both sides, that kind of thing. So we saw how that, rippled throughout. But with the right-wing media ecosystem, it just gave them so much traction. It was like on, all those different kinds of shows. I don't remember, Limbaugh was still, I think, in business, at that time. So that's as best as I know.
Question from online from Luis Gonzalez Marquez. Is there any tension between the Republican base and MAGA leadership, given their differing views on climate? Or on the contrary, is the current attack on climate action changing the views of the base?
Right, that's great. So I don't know. What I do know is that, the young people have been very insistent about addressing climate. If you saw some of the presidential debates, they were getting questions from young people, about climate. And I think Nikki Haley was the only one to say that, in fact, it's real, it's happening, right? And the others were all still, they were denying it. So that was really interesting to me. That was like, oh, we're going back to that. Okay, yeah. Kind of just the over the top kind of stuff like that competing with the MAGA base. But so far, it does not seem to me that the MAGA leadership is just at this point still ignoring it. No, I don't feel that they're young voters. They don't have, they don't have the track record of voting the way older voters do, right? So that's something I think they're probably going to listen to, And I don't know, this is an interesting question, and I haven't seen the data, or maybe I haven't looked for it yet. When we look at Republican voters, so MAGA voters are not all, they're not even half of all Republican voters. They're just under half, like somewhere like maybe 40%. And I don't know if anybody has like separated out the MAGA vote around climate versus the larger Republican vote, right? In how that falls out. So it's a good question. There's also a question right behind you that you can't see.
Hi, thank you so much. I kind of have two questions for you. So the first one has to do with your concept of surplus white nationalism. And I think in your definition you mentioned like these spillover effects that are maybe unanticipated. And so I'm curious about like what is the unanticipated effect of this excess white nationalism in relation to like the environment? Because in my head I'm like, maybe it's like they don't mean to end the world or something. That's white nationalism. But I'm curious if there's like if there are like specific things that you have in mind in terms of like what the unintended.
Yeah, thank you. I think about that too, and I'm still struggling with that. But I do think that, I mean, and I give a lot of I live a lot of props to the Republicans for their level of organization, their strategy, I never want to underestimate them. But I don't think that they had actually anticipated a lot of this stuff. This was not, I don't think, planned, So in that way, I believe it is unanticipated, right? Left to their own devices, they might have just done the regulatory capture thing, but they are, again, they're moving in all these other kind of ways because of the white nationalism. So I don't think they actually like planned all of this. And I don't know that they all still even are, we've been so successful. I hadn't really realized that, about accounting for how they've had the success that they have that they have. So I don't think it's all planned. Yeah.
Okay, that's the last question. I guess it's semi. I'm curious about like the timeline, like you chose, starting with the Tea Party movement in 2009. I'm curious if you've like looked at the sort of conflation between gender equity movements, sexuality movements, movements around race and the environment in the 90s, and that sort of framing that was under more democratic government, like in the sort of discourses that emerged, sort of like knowledge and policy validation that was emerged from that period in contrast to what's happening now. And maybe it's comparative, but I think that there's something troubling about even this concept of democracy. Like your research is like it's focused on the right, but it's also troubling this concept of democracy, the sort of like whiplash of policy that is like inherent to what we understand as like a functioning democracy. And so I'm curious about like the sort of similarities or things that were different in the 90s. Seems like the same sort of like environment in terms of like this discourse between race and gender and sexuality.
So the 90s. So the 1990s? Yeah, okay.
Sorry,
Yeah, okay. I lived through that. I remember that very clearly. So there's kind of different scales that we can talk about that. So one of the things that's happening in the 90s, so we begin talking about environmental racism very clearly at this time, and I'll talk about EJ environmental thread throughout. There's other ones one could use. But in terms of the environmentalist one, right, in the 1990s, we get like, okay, there's this thing called environmental racism. And then there's pressure like on the EPA to respond to it. There's this emergence of all these different kind of grassroots organizations. So it becomes a thing. It becomes a thing. And I feel that this becomes part then of, it becomes like normative almost. It becomes like kind of like, oh yeah, in the air, kind of, I wouldn't say hegemonic necessarily, but very, accepted. And these are precisely the things that really the many people who maybe wouldn't even call themselves part of the right at that time, but many people are like, they're not comfortable with that. These are kind of one of the key stepping stones, I believe, that is leading to Trumpism and is leading to kind of like this growing backlash. Because, when you hear about people they talk about like the liberal media that cannot be trusted. They talk about like the Democrats, and to a certain extent, these very liberal ideas of anti-racism and gender equality, they are making their way into mainstream institutions. You can't deny it. And so there is this discomfort for many people, who will become Trump supporters. And he's just like finding that and just reaching into and getting all of that discontent, right? And giving voice to it, because they couldn't give voice to it because they would be called racist and right. So these are all building blocks, I think, to what we see happening. Now, having said that, we do know, like with racism, there's like, we're in a continual thing like this. In 1990s, gave rise, like, in California here, to the huge, like, anti-immigrant wave that was going on. In 1994, right, we had the SOS thing here in California. And so, we have this going on like that. But then, but at the EJ level, the environmental level, I think it's kind of a more larger trajectory, and that is building up to this discomfort and grievance. Yeah.
We have another question from online. This is from Meg Mills-Mora. Could you speak to the rising role of Latinos, especially Latino men in MAGA, and disinformation efforts? In your research, how are these voters interfacing with the white nationalism discourses at the core of the movement?
Thank you for that question. Super important. I have one chapter coming out on the Latinx right in a book that Dan Hosang and Joe Lowndes are editing on the multicultural right, where we were looking particularly at the Libre Initiative, which is a Koch-sponsored initiative to attract Latinos to the right. So I'm very interested in this. There's a couple of things going on, I think. One, we have seen, again, surprising levels of support, or one might think surprising, but surprising levels of support for Trump in the first and in the second his second campaign. First one was much more heavily male, but the second one now is in growing numbers of females as well, who are also embracing Trump. And, there's, I think it varies by different populations what is going on. So I hesitate to speak about the Latinos as if they had a whole. So we can talk about the, Cubans and Venezuelans in particular and other South Americans as very much embracing the anti-communism, anti-socialism politics of the far right, as well as Trump like being the tough guy in Maduro. And, in other ways, they see him as like kind of the strong man to challenge what they see as problematic left-wing politics in Latin America. So that's like kind of one contingent. And then you have like different other groups. And the most interesting one to me has been, of course, the Mexican Argentine population, because I am, yeah. But but we have been the most interesting because we are also the one that was most heavily Democrat. And that's where you're seeing like the greatest shift in happening. Now, there's at University of Arizona, there is a woman there, Wendy Luna, who's been thinking about and talking to fossil fuel workers and trying to understand the connection between Latino fossil fuel workers and right-wing politics. And I think that work is still in its early phases, but I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, having said that though, I mean, there's just not that many Latinos that are in fossil fuel workers. I mean, even the whole industry doesn't have that many workers, period, right? But that is one interesting strand. The more important strand, I think, is like I think there's like three particular segments where particularly Latino men are coming into the right, and they're through the Border Patrol, policing, and the military. And we know we have about half of all Border Patrol agents are Latino, right? With the vast majority of them being of, Mexicana heritage. So these are the big, I think, pathways, I think, that we're seeing going into the right. Now, there is some work that there's this guy, Alamillo at Washington State, and he has said that, and when we look at Latino support for Trump, one of the key indicators that he does see, or the most important one, was the denial of racism. So if you deny racism, then you can become a supporter of Trump, and you are part of the white nation. And again, for Latinos, we've always been in this racially ambiguous position. There's always been a history of some Latinos wanting whiteness and being able to claim whiteness, at least on a provisional basis, right? And so I think those are some of the things going around. And then I think, I don't want to just also say it's a case of false consciousness. I think there's a genuine history of some of communities that are heavily immigrant based of just pulling up the ladder when we're done. They're different from us, whatever that may be. So I think there's many different things operating here. Yeah, again, a super understudied topic that we got to get more people studying.
Might have time for one quick question. Is there anyone who has one last question? Oh, perfect.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, you mentioned funding organization strategies and the reason the GOP has been sort of ahead of trying to get their agenda. And I'm wondering, what do you think the biggest in
Well, one, they have a lot more money, period. This is capital, right? So there's just a lot more money, I believe, available through the fossil fuel industry, which has been one of the most lucrative industries in human history. So, I mean, there's just tons of money available. This is also the party of billionaires, as well. So they just have more money, period. Having said that, Democrats do have a lot of money too. It just comes from very different kinds of sources. And, I think that the Democrats have money is an issue, but I think there's just a lack of coordination and a lack of willing to maybe work together towards a single goal. I think, like Michael said, this was a 40-year plan of the GOP to take over the judiciary. I mean, that is discipline. That is years in the making. That is like, we're not giving up. We will keep at it. We will keep at it. They have mentors for people coming out of law school. Here, we're going to place you with this judge. You're going to clerk here. You're going to get experience. And then we're going to get our people and we're going to nominate you. I mean, it is well orchestrated. And there's nothing comparable. And I don't know, I mean, part of it's the money, but part of it, maybe we're not willing to prioritize and get together. Maybe we're too fragmented. I'm not sure, but they're winning.
Okay,